Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing?
No.
Good afternoon, everyone.
How's everyone doing?
How's everyone doing?
Excellent.
No.
And we should be doing good because we are in victory.
How's everyone doing?
Winning. Comrades, I have a couple of announcements before I present myself.
And
if
we
you
should be doing good because we
have
are in
an
victory.
interpretation
How's everyone doing?
equipment, please put it into channel
Comrades,
8.
I have a couple of announcements before I present myself.
A.
We should be doing good because we
There
have
you go.
an interpretation
Channel 8
equipment.
equipment, please put
Comrades,
as the letter.
channel 8. I have a couple of announcements before I present myself.
All right, and I do want to thank the interpreters for taking on the task of interpreting all these sessions, which is a huge task.
The interpreters for taking on the task.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Claudia de la Cruz.
all these
I am
sessions, which is
with the
a
People's
huge
Forum.
task.
I am one of the organizers of the
Welcome,
People's
everyone.
Summit,
My name is
and I'm very
Claudia
privileged
de la
and
Cruz.
honored
I
to
am
be
with
in
the
this
People's
panel
Forum.
with such amazing people. I think it's important to say
of
that
the
as the
Summit,
People's Summit,
I'm very privileged
one of our
and
biggest
honored to be
objectives
in this panel
was
with
to
such
bring
amazing people.
struggles together, not
think it's
only from
important
the
to
United
say that
States,
as
but
the
from the
People's
continent
Summit,
and from the world.
One of our biggest
And what better
objectives
way to be in conversation than to be with folks that are representative of different struggles and are committed to the value and the strategy of internationalism,
to be with folks that are
and
representative
the development of solidarity projects across the world. So I want you to give a big round of applause to our panel and the development of solidarity projects across the world. So I want you to give a big round of applause, which I will introduce individually as they are about to speak. I do want to uplift that we have been saying and been very clear that the Summit of the Americas that has been organized by the Organization of American States and Biden is a summit of exclusion. Is a summit that has not only excluded the voices of the people of the United States, of the struggles that we all push forth to access healthcare, to access education, against police brutality, against imprisonment. All of those struggles have been silenced. And more so, the struggles of our comrades, our friends, our siblings outside of the United States. Countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua have been excluded. And we must say that there is no such thing as America. There is no such thing as an American continent without Cuba. Have been excluded. And there is no such thing as an American continent without Venezuela. There is no such thing as an American continent without Nicaragua. And there's definitely not such a thing as an America without the struggles and the movements of our people. The struggles of those that are fighting against misery, against death, against an economic system that promotes war. And so we are very delighted to be in this space with so many comrades, friends, and siblings who understand that solidarity is the lifeline of our people. Solidarity is the lifeline of our people. And when we talk about internationalism, it's precisely the development of projects, not necessarily just proclamations of solidarity, but projects that are able to deepen those friendships. Right now we have someone who wasn't able to be here, a comrade, a friend, a pastor, a theologian, a nurse, someone who has taken on the task of doing popular education not only in Cuba but across the continent. Her name is Isette, and she is the coordinator of the Martin Luther King Center in Havana, Cuba. And I would ask the folks that are on our tech to please put her video. If you could all help welcome virtually our friend Iset. The folks that are on our tech to please put her video. If you could all help
Hernández, soy pastora de la Iglesia Presbiteriana Reformada en Cuba y también coordinadora ejecutiva del Centro Martin Luther King. Mis primeras palabras son de gratitud por este espacio, por este momento en que nos están permitiendo compartir con ustedes algunas visiones de la solidaridad. Sobre todo de gratitud porque entre ustedes hay hombres y mujeres de buena voluntad que gracias a la solidaridad que ejercen, gracias a la solidaridad que practican, han podido unir a tantas personas en la lucha por la dignidad de los pueblos. Vengo de un país donde ustedes saben que la solidaridad ha sido espacio de salvación. O sea, la solidaridad con Cuba y desde Cuba ha sido práctica constante de nuestro pueblo. Nuestro pueblo, desde el tiempo de la revolución, ha sufrido un terrible bloqueo, el cual gracias a la solidaridad hemos podido subsistir, hemos podido enfrentar. La solidaridad, mi experiencia personal, pasa desde los amigos y amigas de nuestras iglesias en Estados Unidos, que durante todos estos años, mi experiencia personal, pasa desde los amigos y amigas de nuestras iglesias, pero también amigos y amigas de América Latina y también desde los Estados Unidos, que llegan a Cuba para conocer, para compartir con nosotros y regresan a sus países con el compromiso de mostrar al mundo la Cuba real y de denunciar el cruel bloqueo del cual nosotros somos víctimas. A pesar del colonialismo nos ha hecho creer que nosotros como pueblo no podemos autogestionarnos, organizarnos, autosustentarnos. A pesar de que la solidaridad ha mostrado que la unión entre los pueblos, la manera en que los pueblos se unen, se articulan para enfrentar las hegemonías y las dominaciones, es el único camino que hoy verdaderamente nos va a ayudar a resistir y a enfrentar todos aquellos espacios de dominación que quieren que nuestros pueblos perezcan. Mi experiencia desde Cuba con la solidaridad pasa no solo por aquellos amigos y amigas que vienen, sino también por la misma raíz del pueblo cubano, la cultura del pueblo cubano. Durante la pasada pandemia vimos cómo el pueblo cubano, en medio de las escaseces, en medio de las angustias, en medio de todas las medidas que recrudecieron el cruel bloqueo contra nuestro pueblo, se unió, buscó alternativas frente a la escasez de medicamentos, frente a la escasez de recursos, frente a los conflictos que tenían nuestros hospitales por no tener los recursos necesarios para atender a los pacientes. Como ustedes saben, en Cuba la salud es gratis, al igual que la educación, pero entre muchas razones también por el bloqueo padecemos muchas necesidades, tenemos muchas dificultades para que la salud verdaderamente sea todo lo que esperamos en la educación también. En medio de esto el pueblo se une, en medio de esto las personas de buena voluntad buscan alternativas, crean proyectos, construyen otras maneras también de que el pueblo siga resistiendo y siga viviendo dignamente. Agradezco muchísimo que este foro esté dedicado a todas aquellas personas que hoy continúan luchando desde los sindicatos, desde las organizaciones sociales, desde los movimientos, desde los grupos que están deseando que los pueblos puedan articularse, que los pueblos puedan luchar en conjunto, que los pueblos puedan alcanzar la dignidad que estamos esperando. Muchas gracias.
The question of solidarity from their sector of work, how do they understand internationalism to be part of the processes that they are developing? So second at this point, I want to introduce a friend and comrade, David Adler, who is a political economist and general coordinator of the Progressive International. He has previously served as foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders in his campaign for U.S. president. We want to welcome David. Served as foreign policy advisor
Thanks very
to
much.
Senator Bernie
Thank you all.
in his campaign for U.S. president. We're wondering, David, if you could speak to us a little bit about the development of internationalist relationships of solidarity that's being developed through the work in Progressive International and the other spaces that you're a part of. Internationalist relationships
Muy
of
buenas
solidarity
tardes.
that's
Voy a
being
pedir
developed
disculpas,
through
hablar
the
en
work
inglés.
in Progressive International
Estoy aquí,
and the other
here
spaces that you're a
in my
part of.
hometown
Internationalist
of Los Angeles.
relationships
Muy
of
buenas tardes to
solidarity
be
that's
here.
being
My
developed
parents are in the
through
audience,
the work
so it's
in
also nice to welcome them. Yes, big round of applause for my
and
parents
the other
here
spaces that you're a
in my
part of.
hometown of Los Angeles. But I thought we could kick the conversation off today. So we're talking about where solidarity is both the bedrock of our struggle. It's the word that we use to define our internationalist struggle, but it's also a total solidarity buzzword. Is both the it's bedrock a buzzword so much so it's that just the last word year, that we use to define the managing director of the IMF, our internationalist struggle, but it's also a total solidarity is both it's a buzzword so much so that just the word year at the same time as she was managing director of the IMF, our international struggle, but it's also a total solidarity is both it's a buzzword so much so that just the word year at the same time as she was managing director of the IMF, our international struggle, but it's also a total solidarity is both it's a buzzword so much so that just the word year at the same time as she was managing director of the IMF, our international struggle, but it's also a total solidarity is both it's a buzzword so much so that just the word year at the same time as she was managing director of the IMF, our international struggle, but it's also a total solidarity is both it's a buzzword so much so that just the word year at the same time as she was managing director of the IMF, our sympathy. We tweet things like, I stand in solidarity with the people of Brazil. What does that mean? You stand in solidarity. You're writing it down. We spoke about projects, not proclamations, but the most common misuse of solidarity is about sympathy. It's a rhetorical gesture. A second one, which is also really prevalent, especially when we talk about Joe Biden and this government, is solidarity as charity. So we're going to give doses of a vaccine that we've produced and starved the world from installing this regime of vaccine apartheid, and we're going to give some doses of vaccine to the world, and that's a gesture of solidarity. So we mistake a gesture of solidarity for one of charity. And the third one, which I think is the most pernicious in its own way, is solidarity as a kind of strategy for continuity. We act as if certain gestures are really, about, even this is sort of cheaper than charity. We act as if, these things are done out of the goodness of our hearts or done because of the suffering of others, but really just to keep a system intact. Right? We think about what the IMF meant by a new spirit of solidarity. They meant new, fresh lending to keep these countries trapped in cycles of debt crisis and balance of payments problems. So I think it's helpful to ground our whole panel today in a new discussion, a new set of definitions, and I am excited to hear from other panelists about how they interpret this word solidarity, but I thought it was helpful to think about the fact that this is not a very old word, solidarity. This is a 17th century creation, 18th century creation that comes out of this moment of the French Revolution where we're thinking about liberty and equality and fraternity. And return it to its French roots, the meaning of solidarity, which is really about mutual responsibility, or to be a bit more clunky, joint and several liability. And this is really how our dear friend Karl Marx understood it, as a kind of brotherhood of deeds. And I think it's helpful to define solidarity as a brotherhood or a sisterhood of deeds, because that is to say that solidarity is itself the engine of internationalism, of a people's internationalism, defined here as the common and coordinated action of peoples around the world in defense of popular sovereignty. So, what exactly went wrong? I don't want to dwell too much on what I think went wrong, but I would highlight a few points of where we may have lost the plot on international solidarity. One of them is certainly historical circumstance. When we were talking about this brotherhood of deeds, we were living through a very revolutionary moment where solidarities would cohere in class, would cohere in nation, would cohere among a brotherhood of nations, a theory of simultaneous world revolution. And we have certainly retreated in many parts of the world from that revolutionary fervor. We've lost that kind of plot. So now solidarity can mean, oh, you know, I feel bad. I feel for you. I understand what you're going through. Another that we need to be honest about is capture. That many of our movements have been captured by what many of us may call the philanthropy industrial complex. That there was this illusion that global civil society, the birth of this new transnational space, was going to save us, that it was going to deliver that other world that was possible. But instead, in many of these ways, the NGOs and their endless buckets of money have come and captured our movements and our organizations and turned them towards purposes of continuity rather than transformation. But I think the most important reason why solidarity has atrophied as a concept is because we lack the infrastructure. There's no such thing as a kind of spontaneous gesture of solidarity. There's no such thing as solidarity simply manifesting out of thin air. We need to build the infrastructure that can facilitate it. I'll give you one simple example from today. Our amazing translators. Without that infrastructure of translation that helps us to transcend linguistic barriers between today, Spanish and English and Portuguese, we have no way to communicate with each other. So if we don't have that infrastructure of internationalist action to facilitate our common and coordinated mobilization in defense of popular sovereignty, then we don't stand a chance. And that's one of the reasons why solidarity has become such a weak concept, because we don't have that good of an infrastructure. That's exactly why we're here today, to build that infrastructure. That's what the International People's Assembly is doing, and that's what my organization, the Progressive International, is doing. 2 years ago, I co-founded this Progressive International with a mission to unite and organize and mobilize progressive forces around the world. And in those 2 years, we've grown a lot and we've learned a lot, now representing unions and parties and movements that represent millions of people around the world, and creating a kind of laboratory for what that solidarity might look like, moving away from a view of solidarity as an attitude and one in which it's an instrument. And I'll finish here, well, I'll gesture towards these two primary axes that I think ground the way that we should understand internationalism and solidarity. One, moving from the global to the local, that is to say, finding ways for all of us to stand up for the respective struggles of our friends and comrades in different places. Just to give one example, I've just recently come back from Colombia, where we were, as the Progressive International, doing electoral observation. Now, we can all sit here and criticize electoral processes and a politics overly centered on winning elections. But one of the things that we found, moving from the global to the local, is that electoral observation can create space for progressive forces to mobilize in defense of their own pueblos, in defense of their own democratic rights. That it's often under the cover of darkness that many of the most authoritarian, scary, rightist, and paramilitary forces operate, and that by bringing the attention of the world to those struggles, we can create a little bit of maneuvering room for them. And the other axis, not global to local, is moving from local to global, is moving away from the isolated struggles in individual parts of the world towards mobilizing in networks that are greater than the sum of their parts. And certainly this is true. I've worked with many of you on our Union for Vaccine Internationalism to say, in the face of a vaccine apartheid, in the face of these institutions that are completely failing to deliver on global health outcomes, what do we need to build? We can't just lobby the WTO for a TRIPS waiver that will never come. And certainly we've been vindicated in the argument that the TRIPS waiver was never going to come. Instead, we have to build alternative institutions that can deliver and produce and distribute vaccines for everyone. So I say, by way of conclusion, that I want to focus this discussion, if I can, and hear from the other people on the panel about internationalism as construction. It's not enough to know people from other countries. It's not enough to exchange with people from other countries. We need to build stuff. Projects, not proclamations, as Claudia has mentioned. And the goal needs to be to live up to the great legacy of Sankara when he said that solidarity is that we feel on our cheek every blow struck against every other man and woman in the world. Thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you so much, David, for reminding us that we're talking about a people's solidarity, and that we're talking about a people's internationalism, not the elite or bourgeois, wealthy type of internationalism and solidarity. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Rabab Abudai. Woo! It's okay. You can do that. Energy's good. I encourage it. Dr. Rabab is an activist and a scholar at San Francisco State University, where she focuses on Palestine, Arab, and Muslim communities and their diasporas, race and resistance studies, transnational feminisms, and gender and sexuality studies. She is the founding director of Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies Program and co-founding editorial board member of Islamophobia Studies Journal. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Rabab.
Thank you. Thank you. I begin, even though the conference began by acknowledging that we are standing on stolen, unceded, indigenous people's land. I want to reiterate that. And as an indigenous Palestinian, I would want everybody who comes, visits, lives, stays, or passes by to always acknowledge the right of the indigenous people to their land, to their life. The struggle continues. It has not ended. It's not in the past. It's in the present. And that's very, very important to acknowledge. Secondly, I want to honor the fallen people, both the people whose bones are still unclaimed, whether we talk about indigenous children whose bodies are unfound, or the bodies of the MOVE kids in Philadelphia, or the bodies of Palestinians who are still being held in something called the Numbers Cemetery by the Israeli military for over 4 or 5 decades. And Israel refuses to give the bodies back to the families to bury their dead and give them an honorable burial. I know that this is something that rings true for many people here throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, because we know about the history and the current reality of these aparecidos. We know in June 10th is going to be the anniversary of the movement in Mexico. We know what's going on in Brazil, what's going on in Chile, what's going on in Argentina, what's going on with the children, the 43 children whose bodies are still missing in Mexico. And we do, and people might say, why are you talking about this when you want to speak about Palestine? Well, first, it's a matter of principle, and justice is indivisible. You can't speak about justice in one place without speaking about justice elsewhere. Second, thank you, yes, I'm glad you agree. Secondly, we also have a lot of connections between the imperialist and colonialist forces and the greed that are trying to control our lives. We do know that actually the first scandal that happened about the Israeli securitized company, NSO, Pegasus software, what many people know, were placed on the phones of the families of the 43 children, of the human rights organizers. It was actually exposed in Mexico first, before we found out that it was placed on a supporter of the Saudi reporter Jamal Khashoggi, who was chopped up to pieces by the Saudi government, and the United States until now is not actually holding anybody accountable for that, even though they give us a lot of lip. Before it was found out in United Arab Emirates, and before it found on the phones of the Palestinian organizations, the 6 organizations that have been criminalized by the Israeli government, human rights defenders that have been criminalized by the Israeli government only because they are speaking truth to power. And when I say speaking truth to power, I am not talking speaking truth to the US power. Because like the people in the earlier panel said, people who are struggling for their right to self-determination, for their right to their freedom, for their right of justice, for the right of peace, and for their children and so on, don't really care much about what the United States thinks or what Biden and this failed summit that he's going to be holding with many no-shows, by the way, is thinking. The United States has no place to actually teach anybody around the world about democracy, about human rights, because the history of the United States is with blood that has been blood from Iran to Palestine to Lebanon to Guatemala to Honduras to El Salvador to the death squads to indigenous people to the overthrow in Chile to our parts of the world in Palestine. This is not something that the United States can do, and this has to do with the history of the United States. I'm a scholar. I've been an activist. I only went, by the way, to get my graduate studies, undergraduate and graduate studies, because I thought if I have DR in front of my name, people might listen more, and sometimes they do. So, okay, so that was actually good to kind of just have legitimization. It does still question what does education mean and so on, but as a scholar, specifically of the question of quote-unquote American studies, I think it's really important to question what does it mean when people talk about the United States as if it's a country that actually was born in democracy and human rights and continues to be so. It's very, very important to go back to the US as a settler colonial regime that was built on the genocide of the indigenous people, on the kidnapping and the enslavement of African people, on the exclusion of people who came here, including people of Chinese descent, on the repression historically of people who are communists, Marxists, anarchists, on McCarthyism, on the concentration camps that were built for the Japanese people, and on every single ill and greed that goes on that makes this country representative and its government of the 1%, not the 99% of the world that we are all here together. I know I'm taking a little bit of my time to speak about Palestine, but I don't think we can talk about Palestine without putting it in context of where we are and what we are doing. My next point is that what does it mean to say new forms of internationalism? So I want to problematize this a little bit, because new is not so new. Some of it is new, some of it has been going on. And many people actually in the US is very, very good about collective amnesia, intentional collective amnesia, which is intentional in the classrooms. And this is why I'm really happy to be here in an academic institution where my colleagues are the ones who are sponsoring and organizing and doing what we should be doing as scholars, as academics, provide critical knowledge, question, provide the tools that we have for the movements in order for the movements to build and grow and challenge. So there are forms of solidarity that I want to talk about, but there is also problematic ways in understanding the ways in which the US government and US policymakers and US dominant discourse says that some people are allowed to speak about quote-unquote foreign issues, international issues, and some people are only supposed to stay in their lane and speak about quote-unquote domestic issues, i.e. indigenous people, black people, people of color, poor, LGBTQI plus communities, labor, people who are struggling for housing, for control of the land and so on, are not supposed to be the experts in Washington who speak about what's going on, because you did not get the degrees in order for you to actually legitimize your ability to speak. And this historically has been the ways in which the United States tells people, do not speak, don't worry about Palestine, it's too far away. Why should you really care? And then somebody comes and says, well, you should really care because the money Israel is getting, I mean, even President Obama, who was supposed to be a good president, gave Israel before he left office $38 billion, $38 billion, and helped them and add more to their offensive military industries and so on. And that is something that actually continues to tell people you cannot speak about that. But this is something that should be of concern to everybody, not only because money should be diverted to a peace dividend. Remember, back in the 90s, we were talking about peace dividend, and because the Soviet Union has collapsed and the socialist countries have collapsed, and now is the time for us to have a peace dividend and so on. And of course, all the military industries whipped up and went into building more and more and more. And we see more interventions, actually, more weapons, including in our parts of the world, but not only in the parts of the world, because as soon as the US ended its adventure of Lebanon, and I'll come back to that, they went and invaded Grenada. The blockade against Cuba continues. The whole intervention in Central America throughout the 80s was going on. Yeah, thank you. And so this is something that actually it's really, really important to act for us to challenge and question whether we do accept this dichotomy, that this is something we should not be speaking about. It doesn't really concern us. It only concerns the experts who know what they are doing. And the experts who know what they are doing are the ones who are killing people around the world and killing people here. So that's really something very important to think about. The other 3 points I'm going to make in the 5 minutes that are remaining for me, and I'm going to be respectful of the time, are, one is that historically, the relationship with Palestine has been actually international. Internationalism has been very much part of it. I don't have time to explain everything or give you all the experiences, but whether we're talking about Palestinian movement, the Palestinian resistance movement, has always been hospitable to people who were fighting for freedom from around the world. If you read about the histories of Central America, whether you talk about Nicaragua, you're talking about El Salvador, you're talking about Guatemala, you're talking about the Kurdish movement, you're talking about the Iranians, you're talking about the Japanese, you're talking about the Italians, you're talking about the Germans. The Palestinian movement has always been hospitable of movements around the world, because Palestine is not in our minds, and now I'm speaking as a Palestinian, in our mind is not something that is owned by Palestinians. Palestine is a transnational issue of justice, is a signifier of justice. And the minute Palestine stops being about justice, it becomes something that's a very local thing that nobody, maybe some Palestinians care about. But it's about justice. It's about actually connecting the issues with each other. On the other hand, also, there has always been transnational solidarity with Palestine, internationalism with Palestine, whether we're talking about the Black Panther Party, whether we're talking about Malcolm X, whether we're talking about Muhammad Ali, we're talking about Robert F. Williams, whether we are talking about the Puerto Rican movement. The hard one, Oscar Lopez Rivera was here earlier, and when he was released, one of the first things he did was to go to Chicago to hug Rasmiya Ode, who was being deported for a former political prisoner like him. Or the Hartford 15 of Puerto Rico, who told Leonard Weinglass, the very well-known lawyer who was defending them, you know what? Go defend the Palestinians in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles 8 case, because they need you more than we do. I mean, this is real solidarity. Whether we're talking about Angela Davis, who goes to Palestine and meets one of the Palestinian prisoners who actually co-authored the letter to her that sustained her in prison while she was in prison, and she identifies that in Palestine. Or Mumia Abu Jamal, who calls collect from his prison cell to a conference on prisoners in Palestine at Birzeit University and says, I wish you luck. And there are many, many examples of that. And I can talk about them on and on and on, about all the communities. This is my lifeline work. But I don't want to continue that, but I want to end by a very important anniversary that's coming up that actually shows what solidarity and internationalism is all about. 2 days ago was the 40th anniversary of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. This is a very important historic event in our history in Palestine. It started on June 6, 1982, and Palestinians and Lebanese came together and struggled and fought. And one of the people that was caught with the Palestinian resistance was none other than the Cuban ambassador to Beirut, throughout the siege, by the way, and lived to tell a lot of the stories. And actually, Cuba took on 500 Palestinian children who survived from the massacres to educate them in Cuba. This is not the only reason. This is one of the reasons that shows the true solidarity with Cuba and says, not only let Cuba live, stop, lift the blockade, and stop attacking Cuba day in and day out, because Cuba is an example of solidarity with all people around the world. By contrast, on June 12th, 1982, 1 million people marched in Central Park in New York, demanding nuclear disarmament. And the organizers at the time refused to allow a Palestinian or a Lebanese to speak to the crowd because they thought that they've allowed the Palestinian or Lebanese to speak about the Israeli bombs that were coming from the US and killing people day in and day out, and the siege of Beirut lasted for almost 3 months. They refused because they were thinking that if we allow Palestinians or Lebanese to speak, we may be encouraging something called anti-Semitism. And they were mixing what Zionism is with anti-Semitism. They were saying that if you are anti-Zionist, you would be anti-Semitic. I'm finishing. So this is one of the major issues that has been a big problem in the movement. Come 40 years later, we are still struggling around these issues, but there is much more widespread support for Palestine. It is precisely because people in 1982, over 100 organizations came together in New York and throughout the United States and put themselves together. Every single organization, there is a huge history going on. You'll be hearing more about it as we go on. And they said no to the the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, no to the US support of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, no to Sharon, the butcher of Lebanon, no to the Palestinization of the indigenous population in Guatemala, where the United States sent Ariel Sharon to teach the Guatemalan government. They said no, and they stood together, and they organized. Among them was a group that I think it's really important to think about when we think about anti-Semitism and Zionism, was called Jews Against the Israeli Massacre in Lebanon. And the group was founded to contest the idea that if you oppose Zionism as a settler colonial ideology, that is a hateful ideology, that's a racist ideology, you might be called self-hating Jew, or you might be called anti-Semitic. And those people who were part of JMIL, and people before them, our comrades, Jewish comrades, from Karl Marx to Emma Goldman, to the Bunds, to Chomsky, to Israel Shahak, Felicia Langer, and many more, and Ronnie Kasrils, and Ruth First in South Africa, and many people are our comrades in the struggle. When we talk about the project of liberation of Palestine, the project of liberation of Palestine also means the project against anti-Semitism, the project against Islamophobia, against colonialism, against Orientalism, against settler colonialism everywhere, and against capitalism. Palestine means the indivisibility of justice, and this is what we are here to do. We all agree, I think, that another world is possible, but we have to make it so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rabab. You brought the heat to the house. Appreciate you all the time, always. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Angelica Salas. She is an immigrant from Durango, Mexico, and she became Shirla's executive director in 1999. I shared with her that I listened to a lot of her videos and was very happy that she was in the panel with us, so that she's able to share some of the amazing work that Shirla has been doing with the immigrant communities, and how do they center solidarity and the project, the liberation project of internationalism in their work. So please help me welcome Angelica.
Thank you so much, and what an honor to be here. My name is Angelica Salas, and I am the proud executive director of CHIRLA. And I just want to say, I see all the CHIRLA folks here too, so big shout out to our CHIRLA members who are out in strength. I also really want to say thank you to the organizers of this amazing, the People's Summit for Democracy. So every single person who had something to do with putting this beautiful, powerful event together, I just really want to say thank you and gratitude. Let's give them a big round of applause. And then to you who are in the audience, it's important that we recognize that you have decided to take a day, an hour, hours of your time to be here, to really be in community, to discuss the issues that really matter in our hemisphere and in our world. And so I do not take it lightly that you are sitting in these chairs, that you could be doing so many other things, but you chose to use your precious time to be in community, to change the world, to change the conditions in which we live, because people are suffering all across this hemisphere. They're suffering in our country. They're suffering right outside our doors. So the fact that you make the decision that you want to do something about it matters a lot. So just with that, I want to begin. So to the question of solidarity and internationalism. So CHIRLA is a immigrant rights organization whose mission is to create a just society fully inclusive of immigrants. So when we think about internationalism, we have to first begin with immigrants themselves. We are a mass membership organization, and as immigrants, and maybe just raise your hand if you are an immigrant, that you were born outside of the United States. So just raise your hand proudly. And it's important that we think about internationalism when we think about immigrants from a place that as immigrants, we live in at the same time, even though we live here, we are also connected to our home countries. We live in these two, we are transnational human beings because we are always connected to those who we love, the families that we left behind, and that we live here in the United States, but that our roots are both here and there. And so we have to always be paying attention to what's actually happening in our home countries, because we are rooted there still, because those who we love are impacted by the policies, many times that are influenced by the United States, but policies that are impacting those that we love. And also, it's important when we think about internationalism, it is those things that are happening in our home countries that force us to leave the homes, to force us to leave our families. So what we do at CHIRLA is we bring together immigrants from all around the world, but mostly from the Americas, in order for us to also create solidarity amongst ourselves, to understand with each other and really to bring strength to each other, because we have experienced the trauma of being uprooted and having to leave everything behind and to recreate a new life in this country. So for us, and I think this is when we're talking about internationalism, and I really appreciated your presentation earlier about, well, what does that mean? It means that we, living in the United States, have a duty to be knowledgeable and know what's happening outside of the borders that we call the United States of America. Because it is important that we understand, for example, that we have conditions in Haiti at this moment that do not permit individuals to be able to advance, to have opportunity to thrive, to hold their family in safety. That we have to be understanding that there has been an assassination of a president, and that the United States now has put in leadership that actually is not advancing the rights of people, and so therefore people have to migrate. They are forced to migrate. And so the questions that we have to ask as those who are living in the United States, who have the privilege of citizenship, but even if we don't, we have to question, what is the United States doing that is, or not doing? Or how is it neglectful in such a way that then forces people to make these perilous journeys in this continent in order to find safety, to find refuge, and to be in a place where they can live as the human beings they are in safety. And I think this is important in terms of the work that we do at Chirla. It is important that we understand that the interventions, and the earlier panel talked about the intervention by the United States in Central America, and really the policies that it has, even after the Civil War, that it has promoted, that have forced people to come to the United States. And that many times the very deportation policies that this country has had has fomented insecurity in Central American countries. That is what's forcing people to have to leave their home. That the economy of remittances without real investment is not actually lifting up whole countries, and that people are forced to move out of their country. That we are living, I'm a Mexicana, and I'm a proud Mexicana from Durango. And for those of you who know Durango or Sinaloa, these are also states that have high levels of insecurity and violence. Many times that violence is actually fomented by policies of the United States, including the easy access to guns that are basically funneled into Mexico, that then creates insecurity in our home countries, that there is a situation that has to be recognized. Again, as immigrants, knowing what's happening, having a fight here in the United States, which I'm going to talk more about what we're doing domestically, but also at the same time recognizing what are the causes that are forcing people to leave their homes. And so that when our individuals, when whole families, when vulnerable people show up at our borders, we are not neglectful in understanding the why they are at our borders, the why they're seeking refuge, the why we need to have asylum and protections. That this is our, if we in the United States are to truly practice internationalism and solidarity, it means being in solidarity with the people who are in motion, who are migrating, because that is the only way that their families are going to survive. And so for me, it's really important that today, as we discuss the solidarity, we think about solidarity and being international here in the United States by ensuring that immigrants are able to have the protections that they deserve at our borders, that we lift up any policies like Title 42, like we abolish this whole Remain in Mexico policy that actually creates absolute closures of our borders to people who are in absolute vulnerability, who are fleeing for their lives, and that we're sending them back to Mexico in border regions that are absolutely insecure, or forcing people to be vulnerable to these cartels and these human traffickers. So for me, it's so important that today we think about the immigrant community and the solidarity with the immigrant community as going beyond where we live in the United States to and really touching all the parts of the world that they have had to flee. So what can we do? And I know that the time is precious. So I'm always about, for Chirla, is what can we do? So for us, it's first and foremost, right now, there are petitions to President Biden. There was a letter that was sent to President Biden, Vice President Harris, and where we said over 110 organizations from across the country that say immediately there has to be advancement on permanent residency for individuals who have temporary protected status and who have for now 10 years been on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. The first thing this president has to do is to recognize all the undocumented people who have no status, no legal representation, legal status in this country. And that is a responsibility that this president has. Number two, we have to open up our borders to refugees. 125,000 people were supposed to be coming into this country, and even that is so insignificant because there are millions and millions of refugees that need support. But the president said, we are going to increase the numbers to 125,000. To date, we've only received 13,000 refugees. Not acceptable at all. We continue to have, we say, close the detention centers. So what we promised, that private detention centers were going to be closed. Have they been closed? The answer is no. Instead, we have situations at our borders where people are still captive. If we want to practice solidarity, internationalism, how can we sustain policies that imprison our people? Finally, what we are also doing at CHIRLA is also, as an organization, going beyond the work that inside the United States, the advocacy that we're doing at the local, state, and federal level for the rights of migrants, and working with migrant communities on the migration trail. So what we realized is that right now, migrants come together in these caravans that you see often on television for protection. This is the way they protect themselves against all these cartels, against the human traffickers, that they protect themselves. So these caravans continue to come north. There's one coming now with over 5,000 people, mostly from Venezuela, but still people from Central America, and yes, also the Mexican community and Haitians, etc. This is their mode of protection. What the response of the United States has been is to now, and I'm going to say subcontract, because that's what you have to subcontract the enforcement to the Mexican government, so that you see huge violations of human rights at the Tapachula, Mexico border. So what CHIRLA is doing is actually has a team in Mexico, in Tapachula, to support our community to do two things. Number one, to understand what is actually happening right now in terms of all of these different policies and how it is going to impact them. For them to also have a means by which they can actually protect their right for asylum, so that they have the proper information, the solidarity, in order for them to understand how to make a decision as to where they are going to be most protected. Is it staying in Mexico? Is it coming to the United States? What is in their family's best interest? That's what we have to do. Number three is to document the abuses. There are significant abuses, like I said earlier, of human rights abuses, and so it is important that we are able to document what's happening, whether it's mass beatings of migrants by the National Guard in Mexico, or if it's the Border Patrol here, the United States Border Patrol around migrants. That is what I think, when we talk about solidarity, we don't have to think about just all the way somewhere else far away. Know what's happening somewhere else far away, but be able to support the migrant communities, because migration is a consequence of all the failed policies in this hemisphere and around the world that force our people to come. Thank you. Somos CHIRLA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angelica, and the folks from CHIRLA. You've been very pivotal also to the development of the summit, so thank you so much. We have our next speaker, Reverend Carleen Griffith Sekou, and she is an international human dignity and rights advocate, cultural strategist, organizer, and public speaker. Help me welcome Reverend Carleen.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Carleen Griffith Sekou, and I organize with Black Lives Matter Grassroots. I serve as the Director of Healing Justice in Global Village. I'm here in LA with our BLM family from Black Lives Matter LA. We have chapters all over the United States, and I am based in Boston from the Black Lives Matter chapter, BLM chapter in Boston. And thank you so much for this invitation to talk about solidarity across borders. And I was really grateful that we started to define what we mean when we talk about internationalism and what we mean when we say solidarity. I think we must pay attention to linguistic hegemonies, right? And oftentimes within an ecosystem such as ours, we use language and we assume that we all mean the same things, right? And that in itself is a problem. So that is the approach that I began to take when thinking about solidarity in particular. And since listening to the conversation, some things about internationalism has been bubbling up. But when I looked at what solidarity means, it is, as I said, commonly used within our ecosystem in a presumed homogeny or sameness of meaning and understanding exists, right? So to take some time to look at what I'd like to make a bit more legible, not as a prescription or by in any way that it is exhaustive or a way to conceptualize historical and contemporary impulses of the aspirations, because what we're really talking about are aspirations more than anything, the aspirations of solidarity. In fact, the concept is really an embodied practice, right? And many of our panelists have talked about that. It's not just a philosophical or an ideological idea. From the Latin origin, I appreciate the etymology, it means something sturdy and firm, undivided, whole, and figuratively, it means something that is trustworthy or genuine or sound, right? You started with the French notion of it in that era, which means a communion of interest, right? And an ascription of responsibility, but also taking on mutual responsibility, right? A kind of community and communality that really presupposes relationship, right? Relationship rooted and grounded in some preset conditions, right? So this brings me back to a root that I more personally identify with as a person of African descent, as one that have been given a legacy not chosen of our own, of a stolen people brought across the Black Atlantic and enslaved as captives, right? But prior to that, a pre-existent cosmology, a term that we know in the popular vernacular as Ubuntu, a South African-rooted term that not only means that I am because you are, or you are because I am, but that people and humans become humans in relationship to other humans. So the concept of Ubuntu is the idea that we're all humans, right? But that isn't a common idea. It isn't. Again, people of African descent stolen from Africa were not presumed to be humans. Neither were indigenous persons that were encountered, right, in colonization. And so when we talk about solidarity, it seems really basic and elementary to us, but it really isn't, because these presuppositions of some of us being more human, or really some of us being non-human, are the underpinnings of imperialism, colonization, militarism, extraction, dehumanization, and subjugation. It is the ways in which geopolitical lines have been drawn, which brings me to the idea of internationalism. We need to trouble this idea of the nation state.
That's right.
Right, therein lies the problem that we're talking about are these arbitrary lines that have been drawn by these imperialist states, right? And we are operating within these prescriptive borders, and still look around you. Not only are we talking about extraction of resources continued by the IMF, deciding who becomes debtor nations and who becomes nations that create globalized, corporatized entities that continue to subjugate and extract predominantly Black and brown, right, gendered, indigenous populations, and continue to relegate a hierarchy of human economies. Are you all with me?
Yeah.
So when I think about solidarity, it should not only be a joining of those with similar, right, attributes. Geopolitically Western, white male land-owning, heteronormative, left, non-left. Those are facets, racialized similarities. But it should include some of those things because we are a political movement. Am I right? Yes, sir. We are predominantly a political movement, but it should also include an understanding of a shared humanity, a shared embodiment, a sharedness that transcends these dividing lines. A more grounded notion of solidarity is grounded in a sense of community, a view that connections and belonging are stronger in groups when grounded in something that is alongside your place, your class, your geography, your ethnicity. We organize around racialized justice and anti-blackness, often inscripted within anti-racism, against white supremacy, but also to make it crystal clear what I am grounding for us in terms of the work that Black Lives Matter, the idea that Black people's liberation is every other people's liberation is inextricably bound up with Black people's liberation. It is because it is rooted in anti-Africanity and anti-Blackness. There isn't a geography or an ethnic group around the world in the histories of imperialism, colonialism, that does not have expressions of anti-Blackness.
That's true.
It manifests in the historical dynamics that I've named earlier, but also in pigmentocracy. Whether we're talking about Afro-Cubanos, whether we're talking about African Americans, whether we're talking about Afro-Colombianos, Afro-Chileans, you name it, ad infinitum. African expressions within our global formation is an expression of anti-Blackness. And until we begin to deal with that and tell the truth about that, we cannot effectively join hands together in solidarity. I'm hurrying. So things to attend to while forging solidarity: a posture of humility and curiosity. Many of us have the privileges of being where we are, right? Where we are rooted. We're in the belly of the beast, an imperialist nation that affords us even the capacity to hold a wonderful conference such as this, or to have the technologies deployed to those who have access to the technologies. So a recognition of these access, which is interpreted as power. And therefore a posture of curiosity to ask, who is not here? Who are the voices that have been erased? Who has continued to be invisibilized? And who does not benefit from what we are doing here? Attending to place-based legacies and histories. It isn't simply a dichotomy of local and global. Global is very real. It is a very real notion, and thank you so much for raising the reality that many of us who are immigrants live in many worlds at the same time. Our economies are shared with folks back in our homeland. Thank you. I have 2 minutes. And so what impacts us locally we live in a global economy, impacts our families in their geographies as well. What impacts us globally is translated to being lodged in real human bodies, often our own families. So I think a part of our task, or what I want to raise here, speaking of black solidarity, or solidarity across all lines, especially and including geopolitical, racialized, and economic lines. Our movement has been international, right? We have been drawn into a globalized and international struggle because folks of African descent hail from varying nations since the beginning. In addition to that, when we talk about contemporary social struggles, if we're looking at Malcolm X with the Palestinian struggle, the Dalit Panthers that modeled itself after the Black Panther movement, or whether we're talking about Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's letter to W.E.B. Du Bois, identifying himself as the untouchables of India and a student of the Negro problem in the United States, and building and forging that solidarity. Or whether we're talking about solidarity with the Roma people across Europe because they are the N-word of Europe, right? I'm naming a broader cross-section of solidarities, but it isn't to be mistaken that even within the United States, our BLM grassroots movement that intentionally struggles against state violences, white supremacist state violence, looks at solidarity intrinsically across movements. Lately, we have had to be in solidarity with the people of Buffalo because white supremacists targeted Black people in Buffalo. We understand Buffalo to be just our most recent ground zero. But know that that white supremacist violence is very much rooted in anti-blackness and all other types of state violences of white supremacy. And so as we continue the conversation, I know I've given sort of a broad overarching themes, but as we continue the conversation, I do want us to trouble the idea of what we mean when we talk about solidarity. Solidarity with whom and for what purpose, to talk about internationalism and is there another way. Gloria Anzaldúa gave us the idea of the borderlands, and many of us live within the borderlands, be it within an anti-immigrant state or across these geopolitical, socio-economic borders that continue to be violent over and against our bodies.
Thank you so much, Reverend Carleen Griffith Sekou. Appreciate you. We're going to introduce our last panelist, not least, our comrade from Colombia, Leonardo Luna, who is a member of Congress of the People, el Congreso de los Pueblos, as a delegate of the social and popular mass political movement of the Central East of Colombia. He is a communicator, he's a journalist, and a human rights activist. Welcome, Leo. And he's going to be speaking in Spanish, so make sure you have your headphones.
Gracias, Claudia. Bueno,
I just want to say hi, revolutionary welcome from Colombia. I don't even know what to say anymore at this point. But I do want to add one of the popular words in Colombia is that we need to take this conference, like, feel humanized, and that we all grab our hands. Thank you, thank you. And so that we welcome, and so that we can feel collectively in community, and talking about all of our different communities throughout the whole world, and in this entire world, and all the people that have passed, and the people that continue, that will. And so if you can say it in English or Spanish, and repeating this thing, a statement of love. For our deaf people, for all the deaf people and the deaf. Not 1 minute of silence. Todo, all in a battle of combat. Until when? Until forever. Until where? Until the victory. And it is necessary. Until the death. Yeah, yes, we will conquer. Thank you, thank you. And for that love from Latin America, and I just want to say that in our little towns, is that this internationalism, it's the love that brings us to the fight so that we can liberate ourselves, our own minds and hearts. And unfortunately, in Colombia, it has something to do with South America. And I have to say this with a lot of sadness. It's millions of dollars that the people in Colombia have spent. And to understand internationalism is to understand all the political structures in the world that talk about the northern. And so we need to liberate ourselves in any part of the world, whether these structural, patriarchal, capitalistic structures, all the homophobia, racism, classism, to surpass that is the essence of making internationalism efficient, to make internationalism with love. and efficient. It has a way of, what's a better example of, I'll be bugging all of you and we'd be thinking, so that you guys can all know each other, see each other, and see the need for everything that's happening in all of our countries, which is historical, which is in the imperialism. Colombia in this moment is, in 2016, has 1,300 leaders who have been murdered. And so that's why the name of theirs, of all those people, and all the things that have gone through, the rest of the areas where wars are impactful, it's the fact that international capitalism, it's because they like to take away the work from our people, and they like to take our natural resources from our territories, and that internationalism, and alone it's effective, we need to permit ourselves an organization. So a couple years that I was here in the US and other places, I was talking about some work. They would tell me, wow, in that situation, what can we do? Should we buy Colombian flowers? Should we stop buying Colombian flowers? What do we do? All of that is great. But first, make sure you join in the fight. Because if you transform this territory, more likely than not, and you focus on the life, that's how we get connected to the Colombian politics. And so that's how we deal with internationalism. And so it's historical that in some of our areas is that the war in Colombia, it has a lot to do with the United States politics. In 1962, I'm not sure his name, but in 1962 he established a mission to Colombia. It recommended that they would arm the people against, and then get a war against its own people. And that was in 1962. We are launching a war which is intentional to not let any civil movement so that it can get to a structural. So in internationalism, it's a recommendation that within the U.S. is where we need to plant a project in the 80s and the 90s, which is a lot of force, and in this movement, and even right now, a representation of our territories where they keep assassinating these leaders. And that's our biggest tragedy. Even though a lot of our natural resources are also being taken. And so this is the first base into getting us into, which has happened in Colombia is that the government that exists or doesn't exist. So there was a law of justice and peace. And effectively, what it did is that it really brought some strength that in creating a space and a Colombian territory where more than 60% of the internationals, they have been taken by the Colombian military, and they're saying that it exists, but it doesn't exist at the same time. And these are one of the things that we need to know so that we can generalize this information in favor of our people, but also in favor of the entire world. And so that we can show all those different wars and that bring in that internationalism. And so in our social, there's been an unpopular. So last year we had a historical moment in the Colombian areas, in all the indigenous places, all the African American. And so we don't want to form any sort of territory. We don't want to form so that we can actualize some sort of actual revolution. And, sorry, speaking too fast for the interpreter. So you have to, yeah, we have to try to talk about all the political stuff going on in Colombia, and also with Francia Marquez. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
This progressive activism, we know, is not going to change the structural conditions of the country. In this sense, we believe in this internationalism. As the comrade was saying, we need to go and make sure that there's not electoral fraud. If our people can be in any part of the world where there's a massacre, any place where we might do electoral observation, that's effective internationalism, that works. It's better than a communique, than a declaration. Our presence, our bodies, that adds up together and can assure that at least these elections can be transparent. We don't know what's going to happen. For those who might not know, we just passed through a first round. Pedro won 42% of advantage in the electoral in the elections against the right-wing party, who obtained slightly more. Right, the second round, there is a right wing that is hidden under this hood of populism that's fighting against the left. Things don't just end here after the elections. You should know that one little step of democracy in Colombia can be important, especially for social movements, so that social movements are able to transform the country. 4 years, we're not going to fix our country, but we have the hopes that some things can change. We know and we are clear that this class struggle is that deeply capitalist class struggle that we experience in our country. It's racialized, it's patriarchal. We know that we as social movements cannot be co-opted by these institutions. We must also always be present to create an alternative, right? A revolutionary alternative, whether we are in government or not. This message was important to us because internationally, sometimes we put all of the eggs in the basket of the elections. And we believe in popular power. Being the government does not necessarily mean that you have power. Being in government is one little component of power. Being powerful means having the social movement being the focus of the country. That the focus is community, is the territory. And folks know that the need to transform the world is something that involves the environment, culture, the economy, and this happens because most folks, if not all of the peoples of the world, have that idea in their hearts. We think that without these minimal conditions, it's very difficult for there to be an efficient and solidarity internationalism. We think that this class struggle that we continue to experience around the world has characteristics of capitalism, of patriarchy, and it's enmeshed in all populations. And there's an important moment happening here in the world. Capitalists are gaining record profits, right? And who's suffering? Workers. And who keeps maintaining those profits? It's us. Those of us, who clean up after the countries in the global north. That's our job, to educate politically, culturally. We have to do this around the world. This is why I'm saying hello to my mother. She's in New Jersey. She is a worker for the United States. We think it's important also to note that this global embrace on this transformational perspective has to be in tune with not just knowledge, but also with the important possibility of loving humanity, right? As the comrade said over here, we're going beyond us, the idea of humans. We are all part of nature as well. That nature, that life that we share, that we have, cannot go above and beyond the idea of a civilization that just imposes death, competition, individualism, a kind of globalization that massacres, that steals the life from our communities. Without that feeling, without that kind of shared emotion, without that idea of defeating individualism, we will not be able to do anything, not even in Colombia or anywhere else in the world. Because we understand that struggles, right, that joining together the peoples of the world, this is indebted to the possibility of transformation. You want to call it anarchism, you want to call it socialism, you want to call it communalism, however you want to call it. We're not going to tell you which is the correct political proposal to follow, but we do know that these values, anti-capitalist values that are going to allow us to build a new world. As Zapatista said in a certain way, a world in which many worlds can fit. A world in which death is not the possibility for human exploitation or the exploitation of nature. I would like to take advantage of this opportunity, right, being here at the heart of the empire, right, proudly. And we have to understand that too, right? We know it's not just imperialism. It's not just U.S. imperialism. There are very different imperialisms that are disputing right now across the world. But there's a possibility that this geopolitics can join us together as people. We have to create resistance in this alternative unity. This is only possible through joining together, through articulating ourselves. I would like to thank very much the organizers of this event so that we can all create a channel of communication to be able to share what's happening in all of our countries. And that's internationalism. All of us communicating with ourselves, with our neighbors in all parts of the world, sharing about the injustices that are happening, but also the achievements, the advances that are happening in regards to liberation in our countries under this possibility of alternative economies, because this is a really important central issue. The economies of the peoples, of the grassroots, these are so important as they are creating politics. We also, as communities, need to create our own economies, understand, technically speaking, the conditions of exploitation, production, and creation, understand how production happens, because the technological devices, the articles that we create for consumption, we're going to need them everywhere around the world to survive, starting with the very basic things like water, basic resources, to very elaborate technologies. We have to, at an international level, we have to really move on that, really focus on those internationalisms that can support international productive projects, multinational transformations that can create liberation around the world. Thank you. Thank you, Leo. Thank you so much. Hace varios meses tuve el privilegio de formar parte de la tercera asamblea de una articulación continental llamada Movimiento.
Interventions from Leo and from Reverend Carlene. And it is that we don't defend what we don't know, and we won't live or die for that which we don't love. Did you catch that? Yeah. I'm going to say it again. We don't defend what we don't know, and we won't live nor die for that which we don't love. And I think one of the aspects of solidarity, one of the aspects of internationalism is loving our class. Loving the poor and working class people all over the world, and understanding that if we have a global enemy which we have identified, and it's called capitalism, and it's called imperialism, and it's called the neoliberal projects that exist around the world. If we have one common enemy, we must have a common strategy. And that common strategy is a people's internationalism, is the possibility of knowing each other and loving each other enough to defend and protect each other from our enemy. And I bring that forth because, yes, the United States, all of its administrations, are very much responsible for the migration of our people to this country. They are responsible for spreading war and misery. And we must be responsible to defend our people from that misery and that war. Que viva Puerto Rico libre. We must take on the responsibility to uplift, promote, and defend life, because capitalism and imperialism are extraction, and their proposal has been and will always continue to be death. And so, are we for life?
Yes.
Are we for solidarity?
Yes.
Are we for the defense of our territories and our land?
Yes.
Let Cuba live. Lift the blockade on Cuba. Lift the sanctions on Venezuela. Allow the people of the world to advance in sovereignty and democracy. Thank you all so much for being part of this space, of this panel. Thank you to our panelists who are amazing. And we are going to conclude the panel. You must feel free to speak to one another. Encuerpémonos, no? Let's embody solidarity and love. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. That was really great. I really appreciated the way you started this panel. Much appreciated. It's really, really good.
You all were great.
Oh, no, thank you.
I love you all.
Thank you. Thank you for coordinating. Muy bien. Oh, hi. Thank you. Inspirador, de verdad. I think we need thank you. Right? Okay.
Great.
Una foto.
Gracias.